She had two starving sons and only one thing left to sell, herself. The wind that morning smelled like judgment and old smoke, and it cut right through Clara May Whitmore's threadbare dress. It was the kind of cold that didn't just chill your bones. It seeped into your soul and reminded you of every mistake you'd ever made. The town of Elkhorn was already dying on the vine. It rose out of the Oj plains like a bad memory, with three churches that preached damnation and two saloons that sold it by the glass. And right in the middle, a gallows, its shadow long and hungry even in the pale morning light. Clara walked into that wind, her boys trailing behind her like ghosts. Silas, the older one, was only 8, but he wore the silence of an old man. His eyes were hard and his jaw was set. He hadn't cried in a year, not since his father. Well, that's a story for another time. Then there was Jonah, just 5. He whimpered with every step, his small hand clutching a fistful of her skirt, the other holding a doll made from burlap and string. They hadn't eaten a real meal since Tuesday. Not unless you count pine needle tea and a single rabbit leg she'd found near a ditch, already picked clean by buzzards. They'd been sleeping in an abandoned wagon just outside the property line of the Cutter Ranch. She hadn't dared cross it. Not yet. From a distance, the house looked long and low, like it was hunkering down against the sky. The barn beside it was the color of dried blood. This was Boaz Cutter's land. The townspeople spoke his name in whispers. They called him the Ox. Part Comanche, part Irish, in all terror, they said. He was a mountain of a man who kept to himself, and folks had learned to leave him that way. The story went that he'd once wrestled a grizzly bear that came for his cattle, killed it with nothing but a length of fence wire. Then he sat with the carcass all night, not in triumph, but in a heavy, terrible silence, as if he were mourning a brother. Clara wasn't here for favors. She didn't believe in them. Life had taught her that the only things people traded in were coin, flesh, and cruelty. She was all out of coin. Her pride was already a corpse she was dragging behind her when she pushed open the door to the general store. The little bell above the door sounded like a death knell. Mabel Pike looked up from behind the counter. Her face was a roadmap of disapproval, her eyes like 2 chips of flint. "Well now," she said, her voice dripping with scorn. "Look what the wind blew in." Clara didn't offer a greeting. She didn't have the energy. She walked straight to the counter, her boys hiding behind her skirt, and she pulled out the last thing of value she owned, her wedding ring. It was a plain silver band, dulled by years of hard work and bad memories. She set it on the worn wood of the counter. The sound it made was small, but in the silence of the store, it echoed like a scream. "I want bread," Clara said. Her voice was a dry rasp, the sound of dust and desperation. Mabel Pike picked up the ring. She turned it over in her gnarled fingers, a flicker of something ugly in her eyes. Then she dropped it back on the counter. The clink was louder this time, final. "That ain't worth a loaf these days," Mabel sneered. Clara's throat closed up. She could feel Jonah sagging against her leg, as if the shame had added another 10 pounds to his small body. "I ain't begging," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Mabel leaned forward, her breath smelling of stale coffee and spite. "Oh, honey," she hissed, "you passed begging 2 towns ago. What you're doing now is selling. Just ain't sure what you got left to offer." Behind her, someone chuckled, a low, dirty sound. Another voice muttered, "Ought to take her to the sheriff. See what kind of deal he gives?" The mention of the sheriff sent a spike of ice through Clara's heart. She snatched the ring off the counter and turned, pulling her sons with her. She didn't run. She walked. Each step was a battle against the crushing weight of failure. She didn't cry, not in front of them. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Back outside, the wind howled, ripping her scarf from her hair. Jonah, finally breaking, began to wail. It wasn't a child's cry for a toy. It was the sound of a hunger so deep it had carved out his insides. Silas just stood there, his little jaw clenched so tight a muscle pulsed in his cheek. He wouldn't cry. Not him. Not ever. They walked away from the town, past their broken-down wagon. They walked until they reached the barbed wire fence that marked the edge of Boaz Cutter's land. She stopped there. The house sat on the horizon, silent and dark. No smoke from the chimney. The barn door was cracked open just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness inside. "Is that where we're going?" Silas asked. His voice wasn't hopeful. It was just tired. Clara didn't answer. Her heart was a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She could turn back. She could try another town, another store, another humiliation. But that meant another night of listening to Jonah cry, another day of watching Silas starve in silence, another morning of catching her own reflection in a puddle and seeing a stranger staring back. No. She took a deep breath, the icy air burning her lungs. Then she climbed through the fence. Each step toward that house felt like wading through thick, cold mud. Her legs shook, her hands trembled, but she kept walking, because stopping meant admitting she had nothing left to lose. And if she admitted that, she might as well lie down and let the prairie take her. When she reached the front steps, she hesitated. The porch was warped, the wood bleached gray by the sun. The door stood wide open, like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole, and that's when he appeared. He didn't walk out of the house. He emerged from the blood-red barn, moving with a predator's grace. Boaz Cutter. He was even bigger than the story said, taller than any man she'd ever seen, with shoulders as wide as an axe handle. The muscles in his arms strained against the fabric of his faded shirt. His face was a landscape of shadows and scars, framed by a thick, dark beard peppered with gray. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. They were still, utterly still, like black ice on a frozen lake. They watched her unblinking, as if trying to decide if she was real or just another ghost haunting his land. In one hand he held a pitchfork. He held it loosely, but she knew he could use it with deadly speed. This was it, the end of the line. Clara straightened her spine. She adjusted Jonah on her hip, took one last, ragged breath, and swallowed the bitter remnants of her pride. "I'll be your wife," she said, the words coming out cracked and dry. "If you feed my sons." The world went silent. The wind died. The birds stopped singing. There was only the thick, heavy stillness between them. Boaz Cutter didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at her, his face an unreadable mask of stone. She could see the calculations happening behind those dark eyes. He was weighing her, judging her, seeing every flaw, every ounce of desperation. She braced herself for the laughter, for the scorn, for him to tell her to get off his land before he set the dogs on her. But he did none of those things. Instead, he did something so unexpected it knocked the breath right out of her lungs. He slowly, deliberately set the pitchfork down against the side of the barn. Then he started walking toward her, not with menace, not with anger, but with a steady, unhurried gait. He stopped directly in front of her. He was so tall he blocked out the sun. She had to crane her neck to look up at him. Still, he said nothing. He knelt. He knelt down on one knee, in the dust and the dirt, until he was eye level with her children. He looked at Jonah, whose cries had subsided into hiccuping sobs. Then he looked at Silas, who stood his ground, defiant and terrified. And then, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man his size, he reached out and took Jonah from her arms. He lifted the boy as if he weighed nothing, as if he were made of glass. Jonah, exhausted and stunned, sagged against the man's massive shoulder and fell silent. Boaz then turned his attention to Silas. He placed a heavy, calloused hand on the boy's shoulder. Clara flinched, expecting Silas to recoil, to fight, but he didn't. The tension drained out of her son's small body like water from a bucket. His shoulders slumped. For the first time in months, he looked like a child again. Boaz Cutter stood up, Jonah nestled in the crook of one arm, his other hand resting on Silas's back. He looked down at the meager sack she carried, a spare shirt, a blanket full of holes, and a small carving knife. He picked it up without a word. Then he turned and walked toward the house. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He just assumed she would, and she did. Numb, confused, and trembling, Clara followed this silent giant into the dark open mouth of his home. The inside was not what she expected. It wasn't a monster's lair. It was clean, but sparse. A low fire crackled in a huge stone hearth. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. It was the house of a man who lived, but didn't enjoy it. Boaz laid Jonah gently on a cot by the fire. He motioned for Silas to sit at the table. Then he disappeared into a small kitchen area without a single word. Clara stood frozen in the middle of the room, her mind racing. What was happening? Was this a trap? What did he want from her? The silence was more terrifying than any threat. A minute later he returned. In one hand, he held a loaf of thick, dark bread. In the other, a pot of beans, so fragrant and rich that the smell alone made her dizzy. He set the food on the table. Still, he didn't speak. He didn't even look at her. He cut a slice of bread and put it on a plate with a ladle of beans, then pushed it in front of Silas. Her son stared at the food, then up at the giant, then at her. Clara gave him a small, shaky nod. Silas ate, slowly at first, as if he didn't trust it. Then faster, his small hands shoveling the food into his mouth. Jonah, awakened by the smell, sat up on the cot. Boaz prepared a plate for him, too. Clara didn't move. She couldn't. She just watched her children eat, the sound of their chewing filling the silent house. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Only when both boys had eaten their fill, their bellies finally rounded and full, did she dare to move. Boaz pushed a plate toward her. She sat down, her legs weak, and took a bite of bread. Each chew was an agony of shame and a miracle of salvation. Boaz leaned against the far wall, his massive arms crossed over his chest. He watched them, not with lust or ownership or even suspicion. His expression was something she couldn't name, a weary compassion, a cautious mercy. It was the face of a man who understood suffering all too well. After she had finished the last of her beans, she found her voice. "I'll earn it," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't need charity." Boaz just nodded once, a barely perceptible movement. Then he turned and walked into another room, leaving the door ajar. That night he didn't come to her. He didn't lay a hand on her. He showed her to a loft above the barn, filled with fresh, sweet-smelling straw and a thick wool blanket. He left her and the boys there, closing the heavy barn door behind him. Clara lay in the darkness, listening to the soft, even breathing of her sons. The wedding ring in her pocket felt like a cold, heavy stone. Below in the house, she could see a single lamp burning. She could hear the quiet sounds of a man moving through his solitary life, the clink of metal, the scrape of a chair, the steady rhythm of a man who worked long past midnight just to keep the ghosts at bay. When sleep finally came, it wasn't peaceful, but for the first time in a long, long time, it wasn't empty either. Something had shifted. The world had tilted on its axis. Outside, the wind no longer smelled of judgment. It smelled faintly, impossibly, of rain. The next morning, frost painted silver ferns on the windows. Clara woke up to a sound she hadn't heard in years, the steady, rhythmic thunk of an axe splitting wood. She crept to the edge of the loft and peered down. In the gray pre-dawn light, Boaz Cutter was in the yard, his back to her. Each swing of the axe was precise, powerful, economical. He wasn't just chopping wood, he was imposing order on a chaotic world. He hadn't said a word to her since her desperate offer. But last night, he'd left a folded quilt at the foot of their makeshift bed. He'd left a bucket of fresh water and a bar of soap by the barn door. His actions were his sentences, and she was slowly learning to read his silent language. The boys were still asleep, their faces slack with the deep peace that only comes from a full stomach. She slipped down the ladder, her worn boots making barely a sound on the rungs, and made her way to the house. The door was unlocked. Inside, the stove still held a hint of warmth from the night before. A cast-iron pan sat on top, clean and ready. She didn't wait to be asked. She didn't need to be told. She was a survivor, and survivors know how to make themselves useful. She rebuilt the fire, found eggs in a crate by the hearth, and mixed a simple batter for flatbreads. The familiar rhythm of the work settled a part of her that had been trembling for months. Boaz came in just as the sun was beginning to bleed across the horizon. He brought the scent of cedar and cold air with him. He set an armload of wood by the stove, his boots thudding softly on the floorboards. He glanced at the sizzling pan, then at her, and he nodded. That same single nod. In his language, it was a paragraph of approval. They ate in silence. The three of them at first, then four when Jonah woke up. The boys ate like wolf pups, their eyes darting between their plates and the silent giant at the head of the table. Boaz chewed slowly, methodically, his gaze distant. It was like he was there, but also 1,000 miles away, lost in some dark wilderness of his own memory. After the meal he stood, pulled on a heavy sheepskin coat, and motioned to Silas. Not with his hand, but with a slight tilt of his head. Silas looked at Clara, his eyes wide with a question. "Go on," she whispered. She watched her son, who had been so quiet and withdrawn for so long, follow the big man out the door. A flicker of something that looked dangerously like hope sparked in her chest. She quickly stamped it out. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. With Jonah playing by the hearth, Clara cleaned. She scrubbed the dishes, swept the floors, dusted shelves that hadn't been touched in years. She worked with a frantic energy, trying to scrub away the shame, trying to build a wall of usefulness around herself. Later, she ventured outside. She found Boaz and Silas by the corral, working with a young, stubborn mare. Boaz wasn't breaking the horse, he was persuading it. He never raised his voice. He just stood near the animal, his presence a calming force, speaking to it in a low, quiet murmur that was too soft for Clara to hear. Silas stood beside him, holding the lead rope, his face a mask of concentration and awe. That evening, after a dinner of roasted chicken and potatoes, Silas showed her a piece of smooth wood. "Boaz gave it to me," he said, his voice hushed with reverence. "He's teaching me to carve. He said, wolves don't ask for respect. They carry it." Clara turned the wood over in her hand. It was solid, real. She looked across the table at Boaz, who was staring into the fire, lost in his own world again. What kind of man was this? A monster who killed bears with his bare hands, or a gentle soul who taught broken boys how to carve wolves? The days fell into a quiet rhythm. Boaz would rise before the sun and work until long after it had set. He rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, but his silence wasn't empty. It was filled with a deep, ancient grief. Clara found her place in the routine. She cooked and cleaned. She mended their clothes. She milked the single goat and tended the small, half-wild garden behind the house. She was earning her keep, but the town had started to notice. When she made her first trip back into Elkhorn for flour and salt, the air on the boardwalk was thick with whispers. They coiled around her like smoke, choking and foul. Mabel Pike stood outside the general store, her arms folded, her lips a thin, tight line. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her eyes screamed it all. Whore, homewrecker, sinner. Clara walked past with her head held high, her boys flanking her like a tiny honor guard. She used the coins Boaz had left for her on the mantelpiece. She didn't ask how much she could spend. She took what she needed, counted out the payment, and met Mabel's hateful stare with a cold one of her own. As she turned to leave, Mabel's voice cut through the silence. "He's a quiet one, that Cutter. But quiet men are like sleeping volcanoes. They keep their storms locked up tight until the day something finally makes them snap." Clara stopped, but she didn't turn around. "I ain't afraid of storms," she said, her voice just loud enough to be heard. "Only of cowards who hide behind whispers." Then she walked out. Every step a small victory. That night she told Boaz about the trip. She expected him to grunt, or nod, or say nothing at all. Instead, he reached across the table and placed something beside her plate. It was a small folded piece of cloth. She opened it. Inside were 6 perfect cubes of sugar, a luxury so profound she almost wept. Sugar was for celebrations, for birthdays, for moments of impossible sweetness. I thought we'd run out," she stammered. He looked at her, and for the first time, he spoke to her directly, his voice deeper and more weathered than she could have imagined. It was like hearing a canyon speak. "Went without coffee this month," he said, his gaze fixed on her face. "Figured the boys could use it more." "Thank you," she whispered. The words felt small and inadequate. He just nodded and went back to his meal. But that single sentence, that single act of selfless kindness, was a crack in the wall she had built around her heart. A week later, the wall crumbled a little more. She woke in the dead of night to find Silas gone from his spot beside her in the loft. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She scrambled down the ladder, her heart hammering against her ribs, expecting the worst. She found them on the front porch. Boaz was sitting on the top step, wrapped in a heavy blanket. and curled up beside him, his head resting against the big man's arm, was Silas, fast asleep. Boaz wasn't moving. He was just sitting there in the cold, letting her son use him as a pillow, his eyes fixed on the fading stars. Clara backed away silently, her hand clamped over her mouth. She wasn't holding back a sob. She was holding in something new, something terrifying and beautiful that she didn't have a name for. It felt like a root, slowly and painfully, taking hold in the frozen soil of her soul. The next evening, she baked a small apple pie. The crust was a little burnt, the filling a bit too thin, but when Boaz took a bite, he closed his eyes. Just for a second. It was a flicker of unguarded pleasure, so brief she might have imagined it. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He took a second slice. Later, as they sat by the fire, Silas, growing bolder every day, asked the question that had been hanging in the air for weeks. Are we staying here forever? The quiet crackle of the fire was suddenly deafening. Clara held her breath. She looked at Boaz and she saw it again. A flash of vulnerability, of a deep and painful loneliness in his dark eyes. Boaz didn't look at her. He looked at her son. You can stay as long as you need, he said, his voice a low rumble. Clara swallowed past the lump in her throat. I think, she said softly, I think we'll need to stay a while longer. Later that night, after the boys were asleep, she found the courage to ask him a question of her own. He was sitting by the hearth, carving another piece of wood, a bird this time. Did you ever have a family? She asked. The knife in his hand stilled. He set it down carefully on the hearthstone and stared into the flames. The silence stretched on for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Had a brother, he said finally. His voice was rough with unshed grief. Younger than me, died during the cold winter, took a fever from a hunting wound. I was off, tending the herd in the high pastures. When I got back, he was curled up right here, by the stove. He was holding my coat, like he was holding on to me. There were no words for that kind of pain, so she said nothing. She just sat with him in the thick, heavy silence. After a long time, she reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and brushed a wood splinter from the sleeve of his shirt. He looked down at her hand, then back at her face. He didn't pull away. She withdrew her hand, but a current had passed between them. Not of passion, not yet. It was something quieter, and perhaps more profound. Recognition. The silent understanding of two people who had carried too much for too long and had finally found a place where they didn't have to carry it alone. They didn't know it yet, but the quiet peace they were building was about to be shattered, because the past was coming for them, and it was wearing a sheriff's badge. The shadow fell across her first. Clara was in the garden, showing Jonah how to pull weeds from around the onions when the darkness blotted out the sun. She stood up slowly, her hand automatically going to Jonah's shoulder, pulling him close. Sheriff Murdo sat on his horse, a big, well-fed man on a big, well-fed animal. He looked out of place in the simple, rugged landscape of the Cutter Ranch. He was a creature of the town, of back rooms and whispered deals. Behind him, two deputies sat their horses, their faces blank and bored. Mrs. Whitmore, the sheriff said. His voice was smooth, like oil slicked over dirty water. He tipped his hat, but the gesture was an insult, not a courtesy. You've made yourself comfortable. Clara wiped her dirty hands on her apron. She would not let this man see her tremble. I earn my keep, she said, her voice steady. I feed the boys. I clean the house. I am not idle. I didn't say you were, Murdo purred, his smile never reaching his cold, dead eyes. But folks are wondering about your arrangement here. Then tell them it's none of their business, she snapped. The sheriff's smile tightened. It becomes the town's business, Clara. When a woman of questionable character trades her body for bread and has the audacity to call it a home. Before she could spit a reply, the barn door creaked open. Boaz stepped out into the sunlight. He moved with that same deliberate, unhurried pace, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He didn't look at the sheriff. He didn't look at the deputies. He walked over and stood beside her. He didn't put a protective arm around her. He didn't position himself in front of her. He just stood with her, a silent, immovable mountain of a man. Sheriff Murdo's gaze shifted to Boaz. He sized him up, a flicker of contempt in his eyes. You married her, Cutter? He asked, his tone mocking. No, Boaz said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Then what exactly is she doing here? She asked for food. I gave it. She asked for shelter. I offered it. She works harder than any man I've ever hired. Her presence here ain't the law's concern. Everything in my county is the law's concern, Murdo shot back. Boaz tilted his head, a gesture so small it was almost imperceptible. But the effect was chilling. Then why are you here, Sheriff? You here to check on my fences? My cattle? Or are you just here to bother a woman and her children? The sheriff's face darkened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by a man the town considered a half-savage outcast. He shifted in his saddle, his hand straying toward the pistol on his hip. Watch yourself, Cutter, he snarled. The town doesn't take kindly to unanswered questions, or to men who shelter runaways. Boaz took one step forward. The deputies tensed. Clara's heart leaped into her throat. Then don't ask questions you don't want the answers to, Boaz said, his voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. Sheriff Murdo held his gaze for a long moment. Clara could see the conflict in his eyes. He was a bully, and bullies only push until they meet a wall they can't break. Boaz Cutter was a wall made of granite and grief. Finally, the sheriff broke contact. He yanked on his reins, turning his horse with a vicious jerk. This isn't over, he spat before riding off, his deputies trailing behind him like vultures. Clara didn't let out the breath she was holding until the riders were nothing but a cloud of dust on the horizon. Her legs felt weak. Thank you, she whispered, her voice hoarse. Boaz looked at her, his eyes heavy with an emotion she couldn't decipher. It was deeper than anger. Don't thank me, he said. Just stay strong. He turned and went back to the barn, but he didn't go empty-handed. He picked up a small bundle from a workbench just inside the door and brought it back, setting it on the porch railing. It was a knife, the one she'd had in her sack, but it had been changed. The handle was sanded smooth, the blade sharpened to a razor's edge. She picked it up. It felt balanced in her palm, solid, dangerous. She wasn't sure if it was a gift or a warning, but as she stood there, the knife in her hand, watching her sons play in the dirt, she realized it was something else entirely. It was a declaration. The sheriff had drawn a line in the sand, and Boaz Cutter had just shown her which side he was on. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was theirs. The snow came early that year, falling thick and silent, burying the world in a blanket of white. It muffled the sounds of the prairie, softened the hard edges of the fences, and locked the Cutter Ranch in a state of hushed isolation. For Clara, it felt like a blessing. The snow was a wall, keeping the town and its judgments at bay. Inside the small, warm cabin, a fragile world was taking shape. The boys, once thin and haunted, were now filled out, their laughter a constant presence that echoed off the rough-hewn walls. Jonah had stopped whimpering. Silas had started talking, asking Boaz endless questions about trapping and tracking and the names of the winter stars. And Boaz was changing too. The deep, unyielding silence was still there, but it was different now. Less like a locked door and more like a quiet, peaceful room. He would sit by the fire at night, carving, while the boys slept nearby. Sometimes Clara would catch him watching them, a look of profound, painful tenderness on his scarred face. One morning she woke to find him sitting on the porch steps, a cup of coffee steaming in his hands, just watching the snowfall. She poured a cup for herself and sat beside him, wrapping the wool shawl he'd given her tighter around her shoulders. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time. The land needs this, he said at last, his voice a low rumble. The snow. It keeps the roots alive under all the cold. Clara took a sip of her coffee. Didn't think you were a man who believed in things you can't see? He turned his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting hers. Doesn't mean they ain't there. She studied his profile against the stark white landscape, the hard lines of his jaw, the faint scars that crisscrossed his temple. She was seeing him now, not just as a savior or a protector, but as a man who had built a fortress of solitude around a heart that had been shattered long ago. You ever been married, Boaz? she asked softly. The question hung in the cold air between them. No, he said. You ever wanted to be? He turned fully toward her then. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, his gaze so intense it felt like he was seeing right through her skin, down to the scared, broken things she kept hidden inside. Didn't see the point, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Not until now. Her breath hitched in her throat. Her heart gave a painful lurch. She waited for him to say more, to explain, but he didn't. He just stood up, took her empty cup from her hand, and went back inside, leaving his words hanging in the air like frozen lace. That night she couldn't sleep. The dreams came back. The sheriff's face twisted with rage. The cold, judgmental eyes of Mabel Pike. Her boys small and starving again. She woke before dawn, gasping for air. The fire had burned down to embers. The cabin was cold. Boaz was already outside, a torch in his hand, clearing a path to the barn. She pulled on her boots and coat and went out to join him. She took the second shovel and started working beside him, neither of them speaking a word. They moved in a synchronized rhythm, their breath pluming in the icy air. They worked like two people who understood that survival was a task you performed one shovelful at a time. A few days later, a sleigh appeared on the horizon, pulled by a single grumpy-looking mule. It was Mabel Pike. She claimed she was just checking on them, bringing supplies. But she'd also brought a storm of gossip and veiled threats. You plan on staying holed up here all winter? She asked, her eyes darting around the clean cabin, looking for faults. Folks are talking, Sheriff Murdo especially. He's not the kind of man to let a grudge go cold. Let him talk, Clara said, her voice flat. Mabel scoffed. You think he'll just let you be? Let you raise those boys on another man's land without a ring on your finger? He's saying things, Clara. Ugly things. About you. About him. She jerked her head toward the barn. Just then, Boaz walked in, stamping the snow from his boots. Mabel's voice withered and died in her throat. I was just, she stammered. You've said your piece, Boaz said. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact. Mabel left soon after, her basket of stale biscuits untouched on the table. That evening, the silence in the cabin was heavy. Clara finally broke it. She found Boaz in the barn, sanding a cradle he was making from a piece of pale pine. He knows, she said, her voice small. Murdo. He knows where I came from, why I ran. Boaz didn't stop sanding. Figured as much. Don't you want to know what happened? He finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. I know what matters. I know you were running from something, not to something. I know you were protecting your boys. The simple truth of his words broke something open inside her. The story she had held locked in her chest for so long came spilling out. It wasn't a marriage, she whispered, staring at the barn wall. It was a contract. My father, he owed Murdo money. A lot of money. The sheriff saw me, and he decided he would take me as payment. He liked the idea of owning me, of breaking me. She took a ragged breath. I said no. I told my father I'd rather die. Murdo didn't like being told no. He hit me, told me I'd learn to obey, that a man with the law behind him gets whatever he wants. Her hand instinctively went to her cheek, remembering the sting, the humiliation. So I ran. I took the boys in the middle of the night. I left everything behind. I knew he'd come looking for me, not because he wanted me, but because I defied him. He can't stand that. Boaz's hands had stopped moving. The piece of sandpaper fell to the floor. The stillness in him was terrifying. It was the calm before a hurricane. He's not the law out here, Boaz said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Not on this land. A few days before Christmas, Boaz brought in a small, scraggly fir tree and set it in the corner of the cabin. Jonah's eyes went wide. A Christmas tree? He gasped. Boaz just shrugged, a hint of a flush on his cheeks. Best I could do. Clara decorated it with scraps of ribbon from an old dress and stars she carved from pieces of tin. That night they lit a candle beside it, and the small tree filled the room with a warm, hopeful glow. Boaz held Jonah on his knee, whispering something in his ear that made the boy giggle. Silas sat close, Leaning against Boaz's side, his face full of a wonder Clara thought he had lost forever. Watching them, Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. Later, when the boys were asleep, she asked him the question that had been burning in her mind for weeks. Why, Boaz? Why are you doing all this for us? He stared into the flames for a long time before he answered. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion she couldn't name. You have no idea, he whispered, how long I've waited for the sound of laughter in this house. She moved to stand behind his chair. She hesitated for a moment, then placed her hand on his shoulder. It was the first time she had touched him willingly. He was solid and warm beneath her palm. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just let her hand rest there, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that was growing between them. The peace lasted until the third day of the new year. A rider came hard from town, his horse kicking up plumes of snow. Boaz met him at the gate. Clara watched from the porch, her heart a cold knot of dread in her stomach. The rider handed Boaz a folded piece of paper. Boaz didn't open it. He just stared at the official seal on the front. Then he crumpled it in his massive fist. He walked back to the house, his face a mask of stone. What is it? Clara asked, though she already knew. He opened his hand and smoothed out the crumpled paper on the table. It was a formal summons. Sheriff Murdo has filed charges, Boaz said, his voice dangerously quiet. He's charging you with abandoning a legal marriage contract, with theft of family property, and he's charging me with harboring a fugitive. Clara sank onto a chair, the world narrowing to a single point of terror. I didn't steal anything. I know. What are we going to do? She whispered, her voice trembling. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not fear, but a cold, hard resolve. We keep living, he said. We don't run. We don't hide. We stand our ground. That night she packed a small bag, just in case, a few clothes for the boys, the last of the sugar cubes, the knife. Boaz saw her. He took the bag from her hands, set it by the fire, and looked down at her. You run, and he wins, he said softly. I can't let him take my boys. Her voice broke on the last word. He won't, Boaz said. His certainty was a shield. They will not take your boys. For the first time since she'd fled her old life, she believed it. They didn't sleep that night. Boaz sat in a chair by the door, a rifle across his lap. Clara sat by the window, watching the snow fall, watching the road. They were no longer just a woman and a man. They were soldiers, guarding a fragile fortress against a coming storm. And as dawn broke, painting the snow-covered plains in shades of gray and blood red, Clara knew one thing for certain. However this ended, it wouldn't end with her running. It would end with her standing. And she would not be standing alone. The thaw came slowly, reluctantly. The world bled out from under the snow, first in patches of brown and gray, then in trickles of muddy water that turned the yard into a quagmire. The air, for the first time in months, held the scent of wet earth and the promise of life. On the Cutter Ranch, that promise felt like a threat. Every muddy hoofprint on the road looked like a harbinger. Every distant sound made Clara's heart leap into her throat. The peace of their winter sanctuary had been broken. Now they were just waiting. The boys felt it too. They played closer to the house, their laughter more subdued. Silas had taken to following Boaz everywhere, a small, silent shadow, as if he believed his presence could help ward off the coming danger. The waiting ended on a Tuesday. Sheriff Murdo didn't come alone this time. He brought 4 deputies and a smattering of townsfolk, who trailed behind like a pack of curious coyotes. Mabel Pike was among them, her face a pinched mask of grim satisfaction. They stopped just outside the fence, a small army laying siege to their home. Clara Whitmore, Murdo's voice boomed across the yard, dripping with false authority. By the authority of the law of this territory, I have a warrant for your arrest. Clara stood on the porch, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The boys were behind her, peeking out from the doorway. Boaz stepped out of the barn. He wasn't holding a rifle. He wasn't holding a pitchfork. His hands were empty. He walked to the fence line and stood there, a silent, immovable obstacle. You have no authority on this land, Murdo, Boaz said, his voice quiet but carrying in the still air. This ain't about land, Cutter. It's about the law. Murdo waved the warrant in the air. She's a runaway, a thief. She broke a sacred contract made before God. Clara couldn't stay silent. She stepped down from the porch and walked to stand beside Boaz, the soft mud squelching under her boots. There was no contract, she called out, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. There was a debt, and there was a man who thought he could buy a woman like he buys a horse. I am not property, Sheriff. I am not yours to claim. A murmur went through the crowd of onlookers. Murdo's face flushed a deep, ugly red. You live here in sin with this half-breed, he spat, his voice thick with venom. You have no church blessing, no certificate. The law calls that fornication. It calls you a whore. Boaz didn't even flinch at the slur. The law can call it what it pleases, he said, his voice dangerously calm. We call it survival. We call it a family. You've brought shame to this county, Murdo roared. Folks are whispering. Let them whisper. Clara's voice rose, cutting through his. They whispered when I was starving. They whispered when I was alone. Their whispers didn't feed my sons. Their whispers didn't keep them warm. This man did. This land did. If that is a sin, then I am a sinner, and I will answer to God for it, not to you. The sheriff was losing control. He turned his rage on Boaz. And you, a landowner, you have a stake in this community, and you let this woman use you, poison this land with her filth. Boaz took a step closer to the fence. The air crackled with tension. She is not my wife, he said, his voice low and clear. Clara's heart shattered. For a split second, the ground gave way beneath her. He was casting her aside. He was giving up. But then Boaz looked at her, his dark eyes holding hers, and he finished the sentence. Not yet. The word hung in the air, a shocking, impossible promise. The crowd went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Boaz turned his gaze back to the sheriff, but his words were for everyone to hear. She is the woman who brought life back to this land. She is the woman who taught my heart to beat again. If you want her, Murdo, you will have to come through me. Murdo barked a bitter, humorless laugh. You think you can stand against the law? You and what army? I admit, Boaz said, his voice resonating with a deep, unshakable power, to sheltering a woman and her children. I admit to saving 3 souls from freezing and starvation. If that is a crime in your book, Sheriff, then I am guilty. From the back of the crowd, a man with a limp cleared his throat. They ain't caused no trouble, Sheriff, he mumbled. Another woman nodded. She taught my daughter how to mend a shirt proper, she said. Then the most impossible thing happened. Mabel Pike stepped forward. She looked not at Clara, but directly at the sheriff. Sheriff, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Last month, when Hank Barton nearly beat his wife to death, you called it a domestic dispute and told him to walk it off. You didn't quote the Bible then. Murdo's jaw tightened. He looked stunned. Mabel pressed on, her voice gaining strength. She pointed a finger at Clara. This woman pays her way with sweat and stitches. Her boys ain't running wild or thieving. She walks with her head held high. What more do you want from her? The crowd murmured again, but this time the tone was different. It wasn't the sound of judgment. It was the slow, grudging turn of the tide. They were looking at Murdo now, not at Clara. They were seeing the bully, not the lawman. The sheriff's face was a mask of fury. His power was slipping through his fingers. The law is the law, he bellowed, his voice cracking. And mercy is mercy, Mabel snapped back. Maybe you ought to remember the difference. It was over. He had lost them. He had lost control. With a final, hate-filled glare, Murdo swung himself back onto his horse. He spat into the dirt at Boaz's feet. You'll regret this, Cutter, he snarled. Both of you. Then he rode away, his deputies and his shame-faced posse trailing behind him. The dust settled. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of victory, of relief, of a future that had suddenly, miraculously opened up. Clara's legs finally gave out. She would have collapsed if Boaz hadn't reached over the fence and grabbed her arm, his grip strong and steady. He held her there for a long moment. Then, without a word, he opened the gate. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose, Clara found him by the corral. He was watching a newborn foal nuzzle its mother. She walked up beside him. The air was cool, filled with the scent of damp earth and new beginnings. "I thought," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "When you said I wasn't your wife." He turned to face her. His scarred face was soft in the fading light. "I meant I hadn't yet earned the right to ask you to be." Tears she hadn't even known were there began to slip down her cheeks. "I don't have anything to offer you, Boaz. No dowry, no family name. Just two hungry boys and a spine stitched together with pride." He reached out and gently tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you and your boys, you are everything." He took a step closer. The space between them disappeared. "I have hands," he said, holding them up, "that have only ever known how to break things, how to fight, how to hold on too tight. But I want to learn how to hold you, if you'll let me." "Then don't ask," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Just stay." A slow smile spread across his face, the first real, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed him. It erased the scars and the grief, leaving only the good, strong man underneath. "Only," he whispered, echoing her own words from that first desperate day, "if you'll feed my sons." He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of homecoming, a quiet promise made in the twilight, under a wide and forgiving sky. That night, as the fire burned low, Jonah crawled into Boaz's lap, curling up against his chest as if he'd always belonged there. Silas leaned against Clara's side, his eyes heavy with sleep, a small, contented smile on his face. Boaz rested his hand on Jonah's head, and in the soft, flickering light of the fire, Clara saw his shoulders begin to shake. Silent tears tracked their way through the dust on his cheeks. He wasn't weeping for the past, or for his lost brother, or for the years of lonely grief. He was weeping because he was finally home. Clara reached across and placed her hand over his, holding it tight. The next morning, something new was nailed above the cabin door. It was a simple, hand-carved wooden sign. It didn't say Cutter. It didn't say Whitmore. It said Whitmore Cutter Ranch. And underneath, in smaller, carefully carved letters, were four simple words. All are fed. Here. So if you ever find yourself on the windswept Oj Plains, and you see a ranch where a woman with scars on her soul stands smiling on the porch, watching her two strong sons mend a fence alongside a giant of a man, tip your hat, because you're looking at proof that the deepest wounds can heal, that the strongest families are not born of blood, but built with courage, kindness, and a quiet, stubborn love. And if you believe that every scar has a story, and that even the most broken souls deserve a second chance at happiness, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and join us for more tales of survival, justice, and the untamed human heart. You won't regret it.